Welcome to this open house on the initial discovery and example strategies for the Convergence at Everett Station study. I'm going to hand this over to David Cutler to start with Northwest Studios. But just to start, my name is Brock Howell with the Everett Station District Alliance, and welcome to everybody for joining today. And David, why don't you go ahead and kick this off?
Sure. So
hold up, David. One more thing. I'm gonna post some intro questions so we can get to know who everybody is. As David talks, go ahead and fill out the poll, and then we'll find time to post the information in a second.
All right. Well, thanks, Brock. Well, welcome everybody. I'm gonna try to expand my screen so I can see most of you on my Zoom screen here. And hopefully you all can see my screen. It's just a title slide right now. But thanks everybody for joining. I'm excited to see some familiar faces from the first open house and from many of the focus groups that we've been holding over the past, about 3 or 4 months. So great to see you all. This is the second open house out of 3. So we'll be coming back to you in a couple months with kind of revisions and updates based on what we hear today. And today I just wanted to kind of open it up, or let actually Ed Peterson open it up with some initial remarks for the group. So Ed, please.
All right, thank you, David. You know, it's interesting. It's been 3 months and 9 days since we did our initial presentation in October. And I think I would highlight the complexity of this project. It's really in the context of a 50-year look at this neighborhood. The Everett Station was built and opened in 2002. Metro Everett was adopted as a framework for development in 2018. Light rail is scheduled for 2036, and the Vision 2050 Management Growth Plan with specifics for Everett is 2050. So we've been trying to do the study in a way that recognizes that as our framework and take a look at what is the vision for this neighborhood, what are the opportunities that are available short-term and long-term, what are the challenges that we have to overcome short-term and long-term, and what could a catalyst project at the front end essentially yield for us. So the 2 sites that we're looking at are all about that broader 50-year context and what the highest and best use of these 2 potential sites are. City-owned properties right at the center of the neighborhood, designed to be the transit center for Snohomish County, Everett, and the Puget Sound region. So you're going to get a good look at much of the work that has been done to identify these challenges and opportunities and options and scenarios. Today, I'm excited that we're at this point finally and ready to share that with our broader audience and position us for generating a final report about 2 months from now, or maybe a little sooner. So welcome all, and I hope you get a good sense of the progress we've made by the presentation that our team is going to make for you today. So with that, back to you, David.
All right, thank you, Ed. Brock, is there anything that you wanted to touch on relative to the comments coming in from the group?
No, well,
Okay.
We're just so everybody knows, we have about half of the people who filled out the poll questions on the screen. I'll hold that up there for a little bit longer before we close it off and bring that back up.
Okay, great. So today we have about an hour and a half. What I'd like to do today is walk through kind of, for the folks that might be new to the room, just a brief introduction and overview of the project and kind of where we are today. Then I'm going to turn it back over to Brock to talk a bit about what we've heard through the course of a series of focus groups and interview sessions, and just kind of the general outreach that's been going on over the past couple months. Then I'll take it back. We'll talk a little bit about the discovery phase, some of the facts on the ground, so to speak, that we've been unearthing through the course of our research and investigations into the project. And then what we'd like to do is open it up and have a discussion about kind of example strategies and phasing by way of looking at various kind of block level scenarios for how development could occur. These aren't really organized as alternatives, so to speak, but rather a series of potentials that could be assembled into a variety of different types and configurations in order to move the project forward. And then, of course, we'll take your questions and comments and feedback. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into just kind of an overview of where we are today. Of course, as you know, this project has been kind of led and is moving forward under the leadership of Housing Hope and HopeWorks, Ed Peterson and Fred Safstrom from that organization, as well as Brock Howell and the Everett Station District Alliance, together with some early input from the city, and they'll be re-engaging as we move closer to kind of final recommendations based on the feedback that we hear from the community. We have the consultant team that's working on this is led by Northwest Studio, which I'm a partner of that firm, and Aaron Young is also here today, another partner with Northwest Studio. We have Chris Fiore and Lanzi Lee from Heartland, kind of strategic financial and funding advisors for the project to help us understand the potential for moving a project forward on the dollar and funding side, which of course is critical. Evan Costiola and Ian Masick from Nelson Nygaard, who have been assisting with kind of the mobility review and analysis related to the two project sites. Given that this is a station area and a transit hub for the city of Everett and the future terminus of the Northern Everett Link extension, those questions are really critical as we move forward. And then of course, MIG, Mark Davies and Bryce Merriman are with us today, and they've been looking at kind of the TOD infrastructure that will be required in order to enable projects like this or the neighborhood to evolve and grow. And this is both the kind of the civil infrastructure that you do see, the poles and power lines and all that sort of thing, streets and streetscape, but also the things you don't, the pipes under the ground. Bryce has also been looking at much of the landscape and placemaking attributes that might be deployed here as well. So really excited to have that team together with us. We've also engaged the Urban Land Institute, which is in the process of providing recommendations for how this project might interface with a future station location, as well as looking at some governance models for managing kind of catalytic projects as they might move forward in the district. That report should be coming out about coincident with the conclusion of this project in late March. So just an overview of the project area. We're looking particularly at two sites, one west of the tracks, the current Everett Park and Ride Lot A, as well as a site east of the tracks, which is currently occupied by Everett Public Works and Everett Transit, that form kind of a portfolio of properties that are publicly owned that are primarily used for parking. And the impetus for this project came directly out of some of the city's planning policy, namely the comprehensive plan and also the station area plan, just looking at ways to better utilize some of these kind of vital resources that the city has. Back in the fall, we were able to take a tour of the project site, just trying to get a clear understanding of the facts on the ground and what's physically there today and how that might be addressed. And one of the questions that immediately came up as part of that work was kind of where might Everett Station as a neighborhood fall on the spectrum of transit communities? Clearly, it's next to the downtown core. It's kind of a pulse point for for transit and kind of mobility choice as it links up to the bus and rail network. But it also has some very kind of unique qualities about it, primarily the kind of the manufacturing and industrial character that's there today. And so one of the questions is, does it even fall on the spectrum, or maybe we should be looking at kind of breaking the mold or understanding the specific idiosyncrasies of this place? And questions, of course, fall out of that is, how do we make the right impact in that context, right? You know, how do we support some of those manufacturing and industrial businesses that are there today, and at the same time enable mixed use, kind of mixed income development over the near term? And how might those two kind of functions coexist and evolve together? Also looking at kind of how we might encourage the kind of the business sector to even grow in this neighborhood. And maybe there's the opportunity for a mid-range kind of Metro Everett scale job center coincident with the downtown. And then of course, over the long term, how does this area grow into kind of a diverse and resilient and equitable community? All key questions that this project is grappling with. We started kind of in the fall with the discovery period. We're working now through design and kind of scenario planning, working towards a kind of a concept master plan, or a master plan concept, I should say, to be delivered at the end of March. And so what that means is that we've been asking a series of questions to the team internally and to many of you through some focus groups and other outreach sessions, to try to understand kind of the range of potentials on any one of these sites. And where we are today is we're going to look at those ranges and gather some feedback on what seems to crystallize and make sense given the different possibilities, so that we can end the project, kind of conclude with an overall vision, but a vision that's backed up by a lot of information and feedback, and that has a clear eye about the path forward. So Brock, I'm gonna stop talking there and turn it back over to you for the next question.
So first, let's just kind of share the results from the first question. We had 19 people respond, so there's 45 people on the call, so not everybody completed the poll. We have a strong contingency of those who took the poll from government, as well as a good mix of business, nonprofit, and others, the community members and residents. And we do have two people who live in the Station District today. So despite the fact that there is a ton of people who live there today, we do have two people in the meeting today. And lots of people from outside the county, but also in Everett too. Of course, this is just less than half of those who have responded. So I'm now going to launch our second question, or our first main question. So just a second here. And if we could get more people to respond, that'd be great. If I can get to the second question. All right. So this first question is just to get a sense of where we're at today. We know lots of things are happening in our lives, and want to get a sense of, what are the biggest issues that we're facing. And then we know we don't want to just focus on the problems. It's harder to list out the solutions into a multiple choice format. So if you could write those in the chat and continue the conversation there, that'd be great. And of course, we are saving the chat for later, so it will be an important part of our engagement and learning as we move forward.
So we'll just give folks a minute or two to answer that, and then I'll turn it back over to Brock, and he can step forward with some of the information about what we've learned through the outreach process.
There's only the possibility of choosing one of these. Was that intended?
If you like to add another, please add it into the chat, I guess. The intention probably wasn't that it would be the only one, that you'd only be able to choose one, so that's an error on my side. But
okay.
This is also valuable to know what is the most important one or the biggest one for you. So, thank you for that question. And David, I could go through that section, and then maybe we could post the results after I go through the comments.
Sure. Yep. I'll move right through that. Here we go.
So we this fall had 9 total groups that focused on different issues related to this project. One of the most important was thinking about, as we address issues today and think about the future, how do we make sure that we're creating a just and equitable community? You know, this past year told so much of the need to double down on this effort. And that work group or committee who was working on it established a few statements to guide our work. And these are kind of summary statements of that here. And so I'm just going to start with making sure that we do this land acknowledgement and statement on racial justice, and then we'll go into the principles that the committee established as well. So the first is, our conversations reside over occupied Coast Salish land, and we honor the area's native peoples for their strength and their resiliency in enduring past hardships while educating non-tribal communities in ways of reconciliation toward peace. Our statement is actually probably about 3 times as long as this, but we're going to keep it this short for here today. And then our statement on racial injustice: we take a stand against institutional, interpersonal, and structural racism that afflicts our country. Equity and inclusion are at the forefront of our principles to counter the racist acts and impacts of the past and build towards a just and equitable community now and in the future. This work is really important in terms of guiding the work of Housing Hope, HopeWorks, Everett Station District Alliance, our community. And so we made a special point of this. We can go to our principles now. So the committee established several principles, and there's longer statements with these as well, which will be part of the final report. But they involve centering community, designing for all people, all abilities, creating housing abundance and affordability, providing affordable, convenient transportation options, supporting a just economy, cultivating safe and healthy environment, promoting environmental justice, and preserving and utilizing our local assets, and recognizing a big asset are the jobs and employers that currently are here in the neighborhood. Next slide. Now we had 8 other focus groups, which are on the screen. And I'm going to highlight some of the lessons learned that we learned through those focus groups. And I think there's a lot more than this. And so those who participated, feel free to add them in the chat as we go. So one of the things that came up was centering equity in the work through engagement and by accommodating our future needs. Leveraging the Sound Transit 3 light rail investment to ensure Everett gets the most bang for its buck. That the neighborhood should be as much a job center as a place for new housing. As well as being the importance of providing the full range of housing options for people of all incomes. While infill development is good, also be sure to preserve what's working well today, especially the industrial business activities. The future light rail station location and alignment will have a big impact on how the neighborhood grows, but regardless, the west site is well positioned centrally for development. Untangling the knot of bus routes and bus bays could make bus service more efficient and free up land for other uses. Ensuring that the road system can accommodate for efficient movement of trucks is an important aspect. Need to improve pedestrian safety within the neighborhood and the quality of bicycle connections to other neighborhoods. Prioritize the neighborhood for people living and working and less for people commuting from outside the city where they don't pay taxes into the neighborhood where they can park for free and commute to somewhere else. So prioritizing for activities in the neighborhood rather than outside of it. More public space is important, whether it's a public plaza, parks, or better sidewalks with more tree canopy. It will enhance the desirability of the neighborhood. Rooftops and new alleyways could also be designed as public space. Develop an economic innovation sector niche to build around, such as around mass timber or cross-laminated timber. And finally, I have written here, explore district energy and ways to integrate surrounding industrial uses into positive, sustainable feedback loops. So those were some of the ideas. There was a lot more that came out of it, but I just wanted to highlight some of the feedback that we got through those work groups. And yeah, and why don't I share now the results? If I can figure out where the poll went. So you should see the poll results on your screen now. The biggest issues by far and away of the folks who responded was around job and economic growth. Housing abundance was an issue. People recognize the city is in a tough revenue situation or budget situation. Then there were 3 results on other, so I'll have to go back and check the chat to see if people wrote those in over there. And I look forward to reading the solutions that people wrote there. So.
Great. And so I think, Brock, to keep it rolling here, I think we're at the another question set.
Excellent. So there are, let me see here, 2 questions. One is focused on, what's holding back our economy here in Everett, and the other is what is our advantages as we look to the future. And you may have additional on either of those, so feel free to write them in the chat again. And so far, hopefully people can see this on the screen because, okay, 1 person has responded so far, so good. People can see it on the screen.
The submit button doesn't work.
There are 2 questions, and I think you get to fill both of them out before you can hit submit.
I filled out 2 and still won't submit.
We might have to send Bryce down the street for you, Paul.
Hey, Brock, as folks are filling that out, how about I kind of touch on some of the discovery work, and we can come back to this question and the feedback when we conclude that piece.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Great. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of the discovery period, which is essentially the research and analysis. And I'm just going to touch on some of the high-level highlights and not dig in too far into the weeds. You'll see some of that information come out as we move ahead into potential scenarios. But anytime we look at a project, and you saw some of this when we talked in the first open house, we like to zoom way out just to understand our context and the potential that might be possible here. And Everett Station, as you know, is bounded by quite a few property lines and rail edges and jurisdictional boundaries and policy levers and other things. But if you look at just the environmental context and the network of kind of estuaries and streams and the climate and ecology systems that layer over the Everett Station area, none of those follow the geopolitical boundaries. And it's just important to recognize that for high performance systems to occur in any neighborhood, whether they're social, kind of technological, economic, we just might need to look beyond the bounds of what we might see before us. Even to the extent where you look back in history and just recognize that, especially when we're talking about coast and native Salish lands, that we're at a point in history and we're looking at development at a point in history that is a fraction of the inhabited history of the district. And just having a framework or a notion of the potential responses that might come out of that understanding is important. What if we could return some of this area to kind of pre-development conditions in terms of its environmental performance? we're not talking about erasing the development on these sites, but just the performance characteristics. It's just something to think about as we move forward. Of course, today the station area is populated by a variety of different critical uses and functions. The station itself, right, at the heart of the district. The station building, which provides tens of thousands of square feet of community and public space for organizations, but also meeting areas. The park and ride lots, the bus transfer stations, all of which create this kind of mobility network and hub that feeds out into other parts of the city of Everett and even to the region. When we started this process, we were beginning from the framework of the Metro Everett Plan, which establishes a series of policy directives and kind of zoning frameworks, not just related to land use. So the area now is zoned urban mixed, which of course allows and encourages a variety of different uses, together with the urban light industrial zone, which emphasizes industrial functions, but also allows things like housing to occur. Recognizing also that some of the frameworks under the existing Metro Everett Plan allow zoning heights somewhere between 7 and 11 stories, which can enable the kind of the 5/2 typical multifamily buildings that you might see in an urban mixed-use neighborhood, all the way up to 11-story high-rises, which could potentially be an alternative model for development here. The Everett Station area also includes, as I mentioned up front, quite a bit of public land. And in fact, the majority of land area around the station itself is owned either by the city of Everett, Everett Transit, BNSF, or Sound Transit, which really creates an incredible opportunity to leverage the value of that land for civic purpose. There are also a series of potential street designations that are outlined in the development code, really looking ahead to how a neighborhood might develop in the context of kind of a transit-oriented district. And one of the things that you'll notice is that street typology and grid is fairly well defined as you move kind of west to downtown, but deteriorates quite a bit as it moves into the district, just recognizing that many of the streets there today are focused on freight and industrial manufacturing mobility. And so what are some of the programs that we're thinking of and that we're looking at as potential for these sites? Well, clearly, given the character and direction of the district, jobs and business spaces are a key piece of that, right? And when we look at Housing Hope and HopeWorks as an organization, one of the things that might be possible here is a kind of an anchor headquarters development for that organization that could be in the range of, upwards of 30,000 square feet, which could be a significant kind of catalyst for development in the area. We also look to key functions like childcare and other support programs that help businesses thrive, right? So folks who are in the industrial manufacturing workforce, or any workforce for that matter, myself as an architect, benefit from high quality childcare and education programs. And to the extent that that can be part of a mixed use neighborhood is really important. Public space, of course, community facilities, things like commute facilities and bike hubs and other access to key mobility functions are critical for the neighborhood, as well as mixed income housing. There are not many residents that live there today. There will be hundreds of millions of dollars invested literally in the future transit station, and to be able to provide more folks with access to that level of investment will be important to think about going forward. As we look at where those various programs might occur and how could they occur on the site, there are a couple things that we need to think about first. And this is really the crux of much of our urban planning and design work, is just finding the empty chair, right? The project sites, both on the east and west side, are both currently occupied by functions that have to find a new home prior to redevelopment or be incorporated into new development as that occurs. And then as we think about how development happens on these two particular sites, while we're not locating the station as part of this project, just understanding the potential the potential for where that station could occur is important. And I just want to walk through a couple of the parameters that will have to be addressed as we talk about kind of development examples and scenarios. And the first is the public works facility that is on the east side of the tracks. That function is currently looking at two potential options for relocation. One is at the Everett Point Industrial Center, or EPIC, which is just up on the Snohomish River. It's a very large industrial zone site that is probably better situated for Public Works' current function than the site as it exists, than the current site as it exists today. And so they're looking at that as a potential move point. As a secondary alternative, they're also looking to move down to sites on Smith Avenue. And the time frame for that move is somewhere probably within 10 years. I know that they're working on a study right now coming to council probably at the end of the first quarter of this year to make a determination about which direction they're headed. But just as we think about development, we're probably 10 years out on that site for at least in terms of timing. Everett Transit, as you know, occupies the kind of the southeast corner of those eastern sites on a property where it has its current kind of bus facilities as well as bus storage and parking. And as they look to potential moves, they've acquired land on Smith Avenue that might be a suitable location for them if they were to vacate that eastern site. Their move, of course, is dependent on Everett Public Works, so they're just behind that in terms of timing, so 10 to 15 years potentially. And then, of course, park and ride parking. If we look at the west site, it's currently occupied by 242 stalls of Everett Transit's park and ride parking, 144 of which are committed to Sound Transit for the station. So in any redevelopment scenario, that parking either needs to be incorporated into a future project, which is that little number 4 that you're seeing on the screen, or it needs to find another home. And there are a variety of locations for that, either on the eastern sites as an interim use, as those sites, as Everett, as the Public Works Department and Everett Transit kind of move about, or potentially on other sites close into the station. Either Sound Transit's property could be incorporated into that as redeveloped as part of the station development. That's the little number 6 you see there. Or it could be located down on Smith Avenue on the Everett Transit property there, depending on where Everett Transit goes. So quite a number of moving parts that may not be, or well, certainly won't be solved by the time this plan is complete, but something that this plan will need to anticipate as we move ahead. And then, of course, anticipating the station. Where might that go? Currently, there are 2 potential scenarios. Again, the station is 15 years or so out, but the city of Everett has been very proactive in organizing a potential location for the station that really provides a link between the downtown core and the existing Everett Station itself, that would locate somewhere between 32nd and Wall, kind of straddling Pacific. And that would create that kind of hinge point. That's what you're seeing there with the number 1s. Sound Transit's representative alignment currently has the station in an elevated condition just south of the existing station building. So that's what Sound Transit is moving ahead with as its kind of initial planning, into its initial planning phases. But there are potential alternatives to that. Perhaps it could go on the east side of the tracks. There might be other locations that will become clear as we move further in to that really a 10-year planning process as Sound Transit moves into its EIS. So the time frame for the station is 15 years out. So we're really talking about very expansive time frames as we look at this planning project. To Ed's point, it could be 50 years that it really takes to realize many of the changes that we are contemplating as part of this plan. So Brock, I'm going to stop there and turn it back over to you, and you can review some of the comments and then head into the next question.
Perfect. All right, you should be able to see the shared results on your screen now. So for the first question, what's holding us back? Not enough symbiotic business activity to build, it says build form. I'm hoping everybody saw that that was a typo on my part of build from, but the idea of being, when there's more business activity, that just begets more business activity. So that seemed to be a very strong answer from folks. Also, just the pandemic and the broader economic concerns and other. And I did notice there was a fair number of things that, in the chat, as well as a basic questioning of whether anything is holding us back at this point. And so just want to recognize some of those comments. And then what are our advantages? The proximity to major highways, rail lines, and the marine port was the overwhelming winner here of 19 of the 28 respondents. And then the relatively more affordable home ownership opportunities was a big second, as well as the downtown having, strong bones, a really.
Rock, you need to scroll the poll down so we can see the answers. We can't see the answer to question 2.
Well,
Is that me that needed to scroll down? Sorry, I'm sharing my screen, so I'm not sure which poll you're seeing.
it should be on my screen.
I think that each individual person has their own little poll widget that they scroll.
Yeah,
I'm able to
on their
scroll
own screen.
mine.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ian.
Nope.
So the scroll bar, at least on my screen, is tiny, but maybe that's just a feature of my browser. So you might also be able to use your arrow keys to go up and down on this menu to be able to see the whole thing.
Brock or David, can I make a quick clarification about the process for station development?
Please do. It would be best coming from you.
Well, it'd probably be best coming from Cameron, but I will channel him in just saying that we are entering into a roughly 1.5 year process where we're going to look at, yes, starting with the representative alignment, but also considering locally favored options or other suggestions that will gather through a process. We're going to spend the next 1.5 years going through various screening levels. At the end of this process, we would like the board to be able to pick a preferred alternative to take into EIS. But I just want to be clear that we're about to launch a more robust engagement process where we'll spend the next 1.5 years looking at potential locations and comparing them and analyzing them with the goal of having something more clear to take into the environmental analysis, roughly, mid-late 2022. So we'll tap stakeholders in this group for that process. Just want to be clear that, we'll be looking at other options and also that the board is going through a realignment process now, hopefully with some recommendations in July. So we'll be more clear, hopefully, about all of the basic project components and timelines at that time.
Wonderful. Thank you. Great clarification.
I look forward to potentially having Sound Transit come back in April and help line out some of this once again for everybody, if that's all right, Miranda. So let's go on to our next question set, if that's all right. And there are 4 questions here. Luckily, the bottom 3 questions, 2, 3, and 4 within this set are all basically the same, with the difference of what year of thinking about development over time and when things are, like, in your mind, are likely to happen, if at all. And again, you should be able to scroll down on your menu option while you're in this poll. So hopefully you see the scroll option. And David, if we could hang on to this for a bit, because I think our next question is quite a ways away after this. So.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. I need to launch the poll.
Yeah. Thank you. There you go.
I thought I had already done it, but there we go.
Hey, Brock, David, I'm still not getting a submit. I got it the first one, but the last one and this one, it just will not allow me to submit. And I don't think Bryce running 2 blocks will help on this one.
That was I don't. I'm
I
not sure we can
telecommute,
help
as
you.
you know.
I'm not sure.
So anyway, for some reason, I'm not getting permission to submit after the first one.
Okay.
I don't know how many others are having that issue, but anyway.
Just as a note to the group, if you do have any issues with any of the kind of technology or any of the interfaces here, please just enter something in the chat. We're going to record the chat as part of this, so that's a great spot for a record of anything that doesn't fall in the right spot relative to the questions that have been asked. So feel free to do that. Brock, do you want to do a quick preview, and then I can move into some of the example strategies, or kind of the key concepts that we're looking at. There'll be a couple other pause points as we move through some of the other groups' information.
We have about 21 respondents so far. If we give it another, say, 20 seconds for people to complete, and then I'll share the results here. All right, 10, 9, 7, 6, 5, 4. All right, I'm gonna close now. If you weren't able to submit, you can add it into the chat. And here are our results. In prioritizing where housing and job growth should occur, what factors should be considered? The location near transportation infrastructure was the #1 vote getter. And of course, that could be interpreted a couple of ways, whether it be future light rail, existing transit, or the freeway. And then the city goals was important. Maximizing potential for jobs and economic growth was important, and repurposing surplus and underutilized city-owned properties. Going down to kind of timing, I'm going to scroll down, but if everybody can scroll with me, I think it'd be helpful. I think the importance of this is you'll just see as we go through, there'll probably be general agreement that there'll be less development in the early years. I see the #1 vote getter for 2025 is some infill on vacant and underutilized properties. And then in 2036, which is the currently scheduled time for Link Light Rail to open, large mixed use development was the #1. And then as we go down to 2050, it again is #1. In the 2036 timeframe, there's a pretty heavy focus as well on infill of vacant and underutilized properties, redevelopment of the city-owned west site, the Cedar Street properties. So you can see kind of the transition that people are thinking of as they go through. And I think that's really helpful as we go through the rest of the presentation, because I think we'll see some alignment there. With that, I will stop sharing results and we can go on.
Okay, great. So thanks, Brock. What I'm going to do now is walk through a couple key concepts that we're working with for the two for the two properties, and they're kind of at a block level. And you'll see how that plays out as we move ahead here. So, of course, we're looking at the station district, but we're looking at it not just from the two specific sites that were part of the initial scope, but also some of the potential orbiting sites that might have a role to play in kind of overall station area development. So we're calling the Everett Transit Parking Lot A, Block A. The Everett Station Employee Parking Lot just north of that is Block B. There's a little wedge-shaped parcel that's just north of the station. We're calling that Block C. And then on the east side of the tracks, where the very large public works site occurs, we've divided that into roughly 2 blocks with kind of a flexible notion of about where that division might occur north-south, just Block D and E. And a couple key ideas that we're thinking about here as we look to the potential for this neighborhood is kind of how might we think about planning for the next generation? And, you know, clearly a future workforce in this neighborhood would need some support services and programs. And one of the key pieces to any kind of work environment is to have, you know, affordable, high quality, reliable childcare for children. And in an urban environment, that is really quite wonderful, but also presents some unique challenges in terms of play space and outdoor space for the students. And so as we look at the potential for that type of program to occur, particularly on the west side, given that Housing Hope has the Tomorrow's Hope early childhood education program that could become part of an initial development. We're looking at ways that we can allow those kind of outdoor functions to occur up and throughout and within the building, potentially even on the rooftops. And as we look at kind of how that one particular example of allowing childcare to occur in the neighborhood might kind of play out on the Western Block, we looked at kind of 3 varieties of how that might function. And, you know, one might just be a consolidated childcare building on the southern end of the block that could frankly be co-located with HopeWorks and Housing Hope's headquarters building, really creating an anchor on the southern edge of that block to help buffer between some of the industrial functions to the south of 33rd and the more mixed use character of the neighborhoods as we move north. Also looked at on that western block different levels of mixed use and mixed income housing, up to about 170 units of mixed income housing and a 5-story over kind of 2-story development prototype, all the way up to, you know, potentially almost 400,000 square feet of housing, which is possible under the existing zoning code, together with some of those other functions like early childhood education and office. We also looked at other kind of key considerations, like how do we leverage the value of the public realm here? It's not just that we have an incredible amount of acreage that's in public ownership used for parking, but there are also quite a number of streets and rights of ways that we might think about how to leverage that to catalyze development. And there are examples of that sort of thing all over the country, really, but we picked one nearby in Portland as the Pearl District in that in Portland started to kind of redevelop from kind of the former light industrial condition prior to the 1990s. One of the things that the city did was allow development underneath the streets themselves to help provide the parking areas that would be required in an underground condition so that development above ground could really kind of build out to its fullest potential and really kind of leverage the value of those rights of way. And one of the things that we might think about as we look at some of the more constrained sites, let's say the block B that we talked about, which is the block just to the north of the park and ride lot that we just looked at, it might be that in order to really leverage the potential of that site, we may need to look at other strategies like enabling construction underneath the public right-of-way. Because as we look at that block, as it exists today, it really can't hold a mixed-use development capacity to which it's zoned, right? So if we don't look at some alternative to unlock the potential of that block, we're really looking at primarily a small format, potentially community program development. But if we were able to kind of build underneath that street to provide parking, then we could unlock some of the zone capacity there, which could be used on its own or could be paired with development to the south. We also looked at key ideas like, how do we increase mobility access? How do we increase access to the station and really bridge the divide that the tracks create between the two blocks in question, between the east and the west? And it could be that we just need to leverage some of the infrastructure that's already there, some of the potential of that infrastructure. The Pacific Avenue Bridge is a great example. It provided kind of a key point of connection for vehicle and freight traffic over the tracks. But to the extent that we can, maybe we can kind of extend that right of way just a bit to now allow for multimodal connections across that portion of the neighborhood. Potentially building a bike saddlebag or path on the southern side of that block, or developing things in concert with the wedge-shaped property just north of Everett Station, kind of in the nook just south of Pacific Avenue, that provide commuter facilities and bike facilities for folks moving in and out of the station. And as we looked at that block, it could be that there are a variety of options to provide that kind of secondary or tertiary level of connections from east side to west side. Everything from locating a kind of a bike hub building to simply building a kind of a bike pannier on the side of the bridge, to even using that property as a parking garage site to help provide some of the needed replacement parking for those 242 stalls, and use that to leverage connections across the tracks, which, to Miranda's point, could be used as we think about Sound Transit's own planning that it's going to be doing for its property and for the station. We're also looking at how to protect manufacturing and industrial jobs, key kind of strategies like buffers between dissimilar land uses, particularly residential, and a few other pieces to help support that condition. And as we look to development in the neighborhood, there might be parts of blocks that are held out so that we can just provide that separation between mixed use and industrial use that really helps kind of protect the viability of some of those businesses, which just have more noise and vibrations associated with them that new residents somehow don't play well with. And those buffers can really become key points of open space or parks and other real civic infrastructure. And that's really critical, of course, as we look to the east side of the site, where we have a fairly large block, that kind of division between blocks D and E, where we might think about leveraging the potential of that zone on the north, but really kind of looking at the needs for industrial landowners to the south and to provide that buffer between them. Another kind of concept that we're working with is how do we just enable business to continue and thrive in the district? And one of the great things about light industrial manufacturing and kind of neighborhood industry is the activity that can occur in some of those spaces. And that activity can be leveraged to really enliven the street and sidewalk space. Examples like Open Works in Baltimore have really kind of taken advantage of that potential to transform a neighborhood. And as we look to what might occur or strategies that we might deploy here, currently the code prohibits manufacturing industrial use on the ground floor of redeveloped properties. And we may just think about rethinking that idea, because it could really be a key piece of moving the neighborhood forward. And as we look at kind of how that potential might play out on the southern portion of that eastern block, clearly there's so many opportunities with a land area of that size and the mix of uses that are allowed currently under the zone. Everything from, light industrial single-story development currently permitted, to kind of a campus level job center, the equivalent of, the Spring District in Bellevue, or the equivalent of portions of South Lake Union in Seattle. Really, there are millions of square feet of development potential over there. And so how might that roll up into an overall strategy for neighborhood development? It could be that from a land use perspective, there are a spectrum of land uses that we deploy across the district, which focus some of the more commercial and industrial uses further to the south, really bordering on 33rd, to create that important transition from commercial industrial use through to kind of a more mixed use condition as we move northward into the district, and then provide those key connections to downtown Everett and beyond. And just as an illustration of kind of the assembly of those different strategies into an approach, this is by no means the approaches, but just 3 different ways to think about the site. One, really enhancing the manufacturing industrial business by kind of holding out the land on the southern portion of that public works lot for future planning and some of those uses there, to thinking about neighborhood development as anchoring a job center in the district. How might that occur, and what might some of the kind of land use and building form needs be to enable that? To really creating a fully mixed use and integrated district that allows housing throughout and provide some of those key early functions and support services, particularly on the west site, with headquarters building for Housing Hope and HopeWorks, together with Tomorrow's Hope Early Childhood Education, and really much needed affordable housing and market rate housing on those blocks. So that was a lot, and it was quick, but I wanted to get the basic parameters out there and thinking out there. And later on, we're going to move, after we ask this question here, we're going to move into some of the consultants' work on the particular issues related to infrastructure, mobility, and finance. So Brock.
So we have just one question this time, and it's after seeing a little bit of the presentation here in terms of what we're starting to look forward. What are the most important issues to address now? And there may be a fair number of things that aren't listed here that you think should be important. So again, feel free to add them into the chat. Unfortunately, we don't have a feature within the polls where you can just add something into the poll, so that way it gets accumulated that way. So we do have to use the chat feature.
It worked this time. Thank you.
David,
No
what
bright
I'm
button.
in the assumption that what you're showing us now is a lot of a preview of what's going to be in the report, and that or we could look more at these slides.
Yes, that's right. What we're doing here is providing a variety of different approaches that we'll need to refine in a report to a. We don't like to use preferred alternative because it just seems like you just pick from the menu, and that's not really what planning is. Planning is about finding a set of strategies that works for everybody, and those strategies might be divergent and overlap. But yes, you can take a look at all of these pieces. We'll post the presentation, and in the final report, the final report will include a preferred direction. There will be a synthesis of all of these strategies. It won't be any one of them in particular.
But the types of graphic layout you're showing us now, that's a PowerPoint, is that kind of a similar to the format of the report? Or
oh yeah, some of those pages are almost directly from the documents that we've been developing. That's correct.
That's what I assumed.
Cool. Yep.
All right, we'll give it another 20 seconds here. We've got 24 responses so far, so I know at least 5 of you have responded to previous questions, so hopefully you can weigh in on this one too. All right, another 10 seconds.
So the question in the chat too about the potential of placing the station underground. Representative Alignment looked at elevated and at grade. At this point, this is the only extension that doesn't have a tunnel, which happened to be very expensive, unless Elon Musk, wants to come up with his boring company. But I would say at this point, that's not been an option. I don't know if that would be kind of out of bounds for what we could consider based on, whether it was consistent enough with the voter approved alignment, but we can provide a better answer to that later.
We haven't been thinking of any tunneling to date, based off of our understanding of the project so far. I'm going to end the poll and then share the results. And the most important issues to address now here is around mobility of station access improvements. And then thinking about the urban design and public realm, infrastructure and utilities, housing, all on the top here. And we did, have, you can see the other votes here as well. So thank you, everybody. And I'm going to stop the share and hand it back over to Dave.
Great. So I'm actually going to hand it over to Evan Costiola at Nelson Nygaard to talk a bit about mobility. And at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to walk through kind of 3 different kind of topic specific areas, mobility, TOD infrastructure and placemaking, and then finance and phasing. So with that, Evan, mobility review from Nelson Nygaard. I'm going to move to the next slide here. And you're up.
Great, thanks, David. And I am having some connection issues, so please try to tell me if you can't hear me. Keep me posted. Okay,
You're
great.
good.
So, what we're really trying to do is get an understanding of what some of the mobility challenges and opportunities that exist at the site today that need to be addressed as catalog development happens and future station area development occurs. The project site really does have some good bones. So it's important to understand some of the site's mobility limitations in order to actually unlock new opportunities as the site develops. So before I dive into the modal networks that you see on the slide, it's really important to note how limiting the site's street network is. Everywhere north, south, and east of the site has a nice gridded, dense gridded street network, as you can see in the maps in front of you. But the grid network in the actual project area is fairly limited. And this creates a bit of a time and distance penalty for people that are walking and biking. And this is particularly punitive for folks that have mobility impairments. For people walking, most streets in the district are supported by sidewalks and ADA compliant curb ramps. This kind of breaks down, or it does break down as you walk along some of the industrial streets like Google and Smith, and some of the streets in the southeast corner of the project area. Sidewalks tend to be very narrow in the places that you really don't want them to be very narrow. Those are the higher volume and higher speed streets like Pacific. And then also notable is that nearly every single intersection corner in the site area is designed to accommodate high-speed right turns, which creates fairly uncomfortable and possibly unsafe crossing conditions for people that are walking. In terms of the bike network, riding a bike or a scooter in this area can be a bit intimidating and possibly uncomfortable for many riders, and that's because there aren't any dedicated or protected or all ages and abilities bike facilities. Bike and walk connections from Everett Station down to downtown or up to downtown and other important destinations like the Angel of the Winds Arena are really in need of some bikeway improvements and pedestrian safety interventions. And we also found that there is a limited amount of bike parking in the area, except at Everett Station, which does have some bike lockers and wave racks, which are not really ideal from a bike damage standpoint. The transit access situation within the district, you can access services from 8 local, regional, and interregional services. So really dense, a density of connections available to people. The main Everett Station building provides access to the Sounder and Amtrak rail services, as well as Greyhound and Amtrak buses. Just to the south of the station, there are 2 major bus terminal facilities that provide access to local and regional buses. And you see a fair amount of transfer activity at those locations. I will say that transit service is heavily oriented towards commuters, and there is a relative lack of frequent service in this area. You know, the kind of shining light in terms of frequent transit is community transit Swift Blue Line. It currently offers, I believe it's 12-minute weekday service. It used to be 10-minute, but now it's at 12 minutes. And so the site really could be supported with more frequent transit service. Next slide, David. Next slide. There you go. So at the beginning of this process, before that one.
Oh. Sorry, my refresh rate is quicker than yours.
There we go. So at the beginning of this process, we went on a walking tour of the site, and some of our key initial impressions center on the walking conditions, connectivity, transit connections, and parking. I think these are going to resonate with you if you know this area or have spent some time in the area. The most prominent finding, in my opinion, was you know, how unwelcoming some of the streets and connections can be. So, you know, whether you're walking on some of the higher speed and volume thoroughfares like Broadway and Pacific, or walking along some of the district's industrial streets, you just kind of get the sense that this space is for vehicles mostly, and not for people. The rail corridor barrier, as David had mentioned before, is a real limitation of the site. It creates 2 true halves, and it makes walking fairly inconvenient and biking fairly inconvenient between the 2 parts of the site. Related to transit connections, and as discussed before, there are many transit connections. The passenger facilities to the south of Everett Station are very high quality, but we really do see an opportunity to shift the current state of kind of transit adjacency to a future state of transit integration. And then there's the parking situation in the district. Parking is abundant and largely free. I think that's the key finding here. You know, some on-street parking is time limited. Most of the parking is unrestricted. There is free parking on the curb. Parking lots primarily cater to people that are traveling to other parts of the region for daily work commutes. But there's also some permitted parking for employees that need to access nearby businesses. There are close to 1,100 public parking stalls in the area that are focused for commuter and permit parking. There's an average daily weekday utilization just in the month before the pandemic. It's at 75%. Some of the parking facilities are better utilized than others. So West Lot A and South Lot B have relatively high utilization at or above 90% daily. And then the northwest and east lots are far less utilized. They have utilization of around 50 to 75%, which means that there's some potential for parking efficiencies. Next slide. So based on our initial findings and conversations that we've had with some of the stakeholders, we developed 6 transportation principles to guide.
Oh,
slide, David.
We might be able to hear you if you're not paused at the moment.
Perfect. Great. So we developed the 6 transportation principles that are kind of guiding our work. As you can see on the screen, you know, we're looking into network sustainability, so redundancy and connectivity of the street network that weaves the district back into the city and creates those connections to downtown. Pedestrian permeability is really related to the steps that we need to take to make safe walking environments, close gaps in the pedestrian network, reduce some of those long pedestrian walk times across the district, and provide pedestrian-oriented spaces. Bike network supportiveness, there truly isn't a bike network at this point. So we want to look into some concepts to create an all ages and abilities bike network through the site and connecting into the site. Shared parking potential. There are both on and off street parking strategies that can be pursued to maximize space and really ensure that we're gaining the most value out of those spaces. The site currently has a mode share target that's been established through the comp plan. I think it's about a 45% non-single occupant vehicle mode split. And so future development needs to kind of move the needle towards reaching that mode share target. And then finally, we want to get alignment with future transit investments and the systems that can integrate with development so that we can create a seamless transportation experience. All right, now moving into the strategic direction. Our strategic direction centers around 4 main questions. The questions that we're trying to answer are related to how development can support a PED first district that is also transit oriented and reduces the need for parking. How might development opportunities best connect people to both the current multimodal transit center and downtown Everett? How transportation demand management strategies and effective parking management strategies can actually help catalyze development. And then finally, and this is something that David was impressing on earlier, is how we actually balance development of a pedestrian first and transit oriented community with ongoing industrial uses. Next slide. So we've identified 4 strategic directions with some potential actions. You know, again, a lot of work needs to go in this, but these are just some initial opportunities that we've identified. First is to manage demand for vehicle trips, off-street parking, and curb access. As I mentioned, there's that 45% non-single occupant vehicle mode split target that the city is trying to meet by 2035. And you know, one of our most prominent findings is that parking is oversupplied, it is undermanaged, and it's really almost guaranteeing that people will continue to drive to and from the project area. And so parking and transportation demand management policy and programming is one of the most effective tools that we have here. And we're hoping that the city and the site stakeholders can align on development of these demand management strategies. This would include a parking management strategy that optimizes existing off-street supply and the curb network. And as part of this, we believe that the current parking supply, as well as you know, the potential future land use development, can actually support a district shared parking model, which is where you aim to address peak parking on an hourly basis. You look at parking demand district wide rather than looking at parking as a whole and looking at parking demand cumulatively for each land use. So there's a lot of potential there. We also think that a district TDM ordinance is in order here that requires developers, property managers, employers to actually implement robust TDM programs. And that might look like bundled mobility passes or better access to car share for folks that don't have a car, or transit passes or other multimodal amenities. Next slide. The second direction is related to street investments. And first and foremost, there are going to be various demands on district streets related to mobility, loading, parking, but also more of an emphasis on public space, potential new park spaces within the public right of way. And this is really going to require a thoughtful look at how you prioritize space throughout the district and along every single street. So this is going to be really critical as there is interest to make the limited network that you have to do much more for more people that are going to be there in the future. There's a strong interest to maintain industrial land uses, which is going to require accommodations for freight and delivery within a more walkable transit-oriented district. So we need to ensure that streets are going to be both human scale, but also can provide and facilitate the movement of transit and freight. We also think that there needs to be a coordinated effort to align new enhanced pedestrian crossings with pedestrian and bicycle desire lines. One of the benefits of a site that has limited street connections, but large parcels, is that we can create cut-through opportunities. So a coordinated approach to that is really in order. Next slide. The third direction is related to active mobility. I saw a lot of comments in the chat box looking at there's real need for better pedestrian and bicycle facilities. The first opportunity is to what we're calling creating the loop. The east-west division in the site creates a real problem in terms of connections across the district. And so we think that a branded loop facility for people that are walking, biking, rolling, scooting, or what have you, is really in order. And some of those concepts were on some of the slides that David had showed earlier. We also think that potentially pedestrian only streets and shared streets are a great opportunity. We think that 32nd Street is a prime candidate for a street closure and rededicated to public space and walking and hanging out and eating food. There are also shared street opportunities that might connect into the future Link Light Rail Station, as well as many of the streets in the southeast corner of the site that are more industrial in nature. We think that's a possibility. And then finally, this area really needs some higher quality bikeways, and the city should think about protected bike lane connections to and through the district. We think there are opportunities on Smith, on Pine, Payne, and even Pacific. Next slide. And the fourth and final direction is related to station access. This is a great opportunity to develop a true mobility hub. I mean, the Everett Station does operate as a mobility hub currently, but things are a little bit disconnected. And there is need to co-locate more mobility options and amenities to meet the diversity of travel needs and preferences for the people that are using the station, but also the diversity of needs and mobility needs for people that are going to be living there 10, 15 years down the line. So more opportunities for bike share, more opportunities for car share, dedicated locations for passenger loading. The hub area really should also better locate and invest in end of trip facilities for people that are biking to and from the station. So that could be anything from more short-term bike parking, there's long-term bike parking opportunities, more bike maintenance facilities, and the like. And the hub really can benefit from a coordinated and multimodal wayfinding system so that it would increase site legibility and help people understand what transportation options are available to them at any point in the district. That is it for now. There's a lot more opportunities than what we've presented here, but this is just a taste.
Thanks, Evan. If there are comments, please add them into the chat or questions, and we can pick those up at the conclusion of the meeting. I want to turn it over to MIG, to Mark Davies and Bryce Merriman to talk through some of the civil infrastructure issues, and just a note on time. I think we're at 1:23. Brock, we may need to pick up the pace or extend the meeting a bit here.
Yep.
Okay.
So I think we're probably looking at 1:45, something like that, if people are planning the rest of their afternoon. 1:45, 1:50, something like that for the wrap up of the open house.
Okay. So Bryson and Mark.
Take it away. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mark Davies, civil engineer with MIG. The discovery phase for us is more not just stormwater, but infrastructure in general. It's, we looked at here on what are the existing right-of-ways. This provides us the opportunity to, look at, what we can fit in within that 80-foot right-of-way. I mean, 80 foot is, fairly generous within the means, because, as you heard from David and Evan, with the buildings, infrastructure, mobility, we're looking also to, what else can we handle for increasing pedestrian areas, green stormwater infrastructure. Next slide. So even within the 80-foot right-of-way, you still there?
Yep.
Okay, next slide coming up, a little slower on my end. Okay, this one is more showing within that 80-foot right-of-way, what is that distance between curb to curb? Currently, as we heard, it's really dominating for those vehicles, for both movement and for parking. A lot of the streets, at least on the east side, have angled or pull-in parking. So where can we reuse some of that space to add in more walkways and green stormwater infrastructure? Next slide. One of the other things that we're doing for discovery is, how is the stormwater handled within the site? As you see from the city of Everett, this is their drainage basin map. The TOD area is really within a combined sewer. What does this mean? It's based on, more on pipe capacity. Flow control may be required depending on how the system is downstream. One thing we don't want to do is influence a lot more flow to this site and have combined sewer overflows. So it's more concerned about detaining stormwater flows versus really that water quality. The water quality is really handled by the stormwater treatment plants. But then we, step back and, what are the main goals for this redevelopment? Are we really trying to mimic those, pre-existing forested conditions? So maybe, we look at going beyond and above just code related and really try to look at, infiltrating more water, reusing more water on sites. Next slide. Hand it over to Bryce. I'll talk more on the public space.
Yeah, I'll be relatively brief here. And I think when we look at public space in the district, one of the big takeaways is sort of the lack of dedicated people space. And I think that other observers have made similar findings. And it's not just within the discrete bounds of the study area, but kind of around the neighborhood. Where are those places where kids can go play, where people can recreate, where you can, have an outdoor picnic or something like that? So we start to look at what are those spaces then within the district where we can begin to carve out some public spaces. And the bounding boxes that are shown on the screen are sort of those areas that are either have existing uses or are potentially future development spots. Go ahead to the next slide, David. So this is the rest of the area that's available to us. those streets, those sidewalks, the spaces in between buildings, which ends up being about half of the total acre, both within and acreage, both within and surrounding the study area. Go ahead, David. I think the key question that we want to ask ourselves as we're thinking about how we redeploy that inventory of horizontal space, how do we frame it up so that we're investing in that space in a way that advances these equity principles, that centers community, that designs for all, that cultivates safe and healthy environment, that promotes environmental justice and preserves and utilizes local assets. And that's where we're going to go next, is thinking about those opportunities. Mark, I'm going to turn it back to you to talk about the
Sure.
framework here.
So there's already a bunch of discussions on street typologies. You know, as we look at moving people, bicyclists, transit, and even freight mobility, we could come up with the typologies for the different modes of transportation. Next slide. You know, we're looking at, you know, more of those larger vehicle movements. So with that, looking at, you know, more of the industrial large trucks where you need to get them through the street, but also around the corners. So accommodating those movements, you might have a little bit wider streets, and then, but still want to, you know, within the 80 feet, to provide access for pedestrians. So it's reusing potentially some of that pull-in parking to more parallel parking and taking advantage of some of that space. Next slide. Okay. For local streets, it's more about that calming effect. You know, where I think Evan already mentions where can you know, sit out and have a calming walking area. So it's narrowing down the streets, adding a little bit more sidewalks, and also enhancing areas for plantings. You can see photos of the right-hand corner, more of, you know, stormwater treatment facilities, infiltration along that. And then, you know, another thing we'll look at is, you know, multimodal. Another typology is, you know, those protected bike lanes, where can we incorporate and separate, and having people, you know, cut through and connect to the transit facilities. Here, Bryce will talk more about, you know, taking advantage of that right away and using it more of a gathering space.
Yeah, and I think that several observers, Dave has spoken to this, Evan spoke to this a little bit, have looked at the opportunity that 32nd provides in connecting Everett Station back up across Broadway and really connecting it potentially to downtown, and how do you strengthen that connection? And it's sort of begging to be more of a people space. And there's two models that we wanted to put on the table for the community to consider today. One is the opportunity of using this street typology that's borrowed from the Netherlands called a Woonerf. And the idea is that it is a people space where cars and vehicles are the invited guest. So it's slow speed. It is often quite green and sort of filled with art, the way that you see in the upper right-hand image there. And it's really a place that people can feel like they can walk across at any spot and not feel like they're going to get hit by someone. That still accommodates that vehicular mobility. The next option, go ahead, David, is perhaps a little bit more interventionist. And this imagines closing some or all of that street. Right here in this option, we're kind of showing it happening from the alleyway there towards the station, but closing it down and letting it be a performance space, letting it be a plaza, letting it be a water park where kids can play, where adults can gather after coming home from a busy day of work and, you know, maybe enjoying a concert. That it's a space that is explicitly and always dedicated to people, that we create that that spot that's sort of missing within the district right now, using that right of way in a different way. I think that's our last slide here. Well, and thank you. So some examples of that is gathering spaces where people can gather after work. Go ahead, David. Places where the street can be shut down and turned over for performance. This is Bell Street in Seattle. Go ahead. Places where water play can occur, connect to the Snohomish and to the Sound. Go ahead. Places where we can treat and hold on to stormwater so that we're reducing our environmental load and improving it for people and for salmon. Go ahead. And finally, places that reflect the living history of this place. That industrial heritage is something that I don't think anyone wants to lose, and that we need to talk about it and celebrate it in some way. And this is an example that some colleagues of ours worked on down in LA, where it was very much a working landscape, and those industrial uses were still there, but that doesn't mean it still can't also be a place for people. Sort of that, this is an exciting image for us for where we might want to take public spaces in the area. I think that's it for us.
Yeah, thanks, Bryce. Thanks, Mark. I want to turn it over to Heartland to talk a little bit about the market conditions and also kind of funding and finance for potential projects here. So Chris and Lanzi, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dave. For the sake of time, I think we can skip this page. You could go to the next page. Hi, Dave.
Yep. Did you get the next slide up there for you?
Yes. Yes.
Great.
Thank you. Well, so the
Get a
team
little bit louder.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the team has set a great vision for the district. And in this section, Chris and I will discuss potential project implementation strategy and what a public-private partnership structure might look like and what's the timeline looks like for the West Catalyst property especially. So the city of Everett and Housing Hope have many assets to leverage to support the vision for the district. As you see on the map, these are properties owned by the city. And we have potential site control of private properties. Housing Hope have strong experience in affordable housing development. And we also have the support to attract public funding for public realm improvements. And Tomorrow Hope's experience in early childhood education center operations will definitely help with the development program that we have in the plan. Next slide, please. Sorry, there's a lag on my end. So to focus on the west side for now, to realize this vision, there are several strategic steps that we think the city and Housing Hope can take. First of all, Housing Hope and the city will create the vision, define public realm, and the development goals for the district. The program team will then need to plan and secure public investment for public realm and open space improvements. Housing Hope will develop an integrated affordable housing project, potentially with the Early Child Education Center and Housing Hope's office headquarters as part of a building on its own, depending on the development timeline, but as a catalyst project for the West Catalyst site. And finally, we see the city can issue a public offering to solicit the right development partners for the mixed-use development for the balance of the property. Next slide, please. We know the Early Childhood Education Center, as Dave mentioned, is an important component of this project, and to house Tomorrow Hope's growing early childcare program. And building a childcare center is not cheap. The turnkey development cost could be $650 per square foot. The development could be partially financed by a permanent loan underwritten by future rent revenue, but there will also be a large equity gap. So luckily, there's a number of federal, state, and local resources that the project team can pursue to fill the funding gap, including but not limited to federal new market tax credits, low-income housing tax credit, grants from Department of Education, Early Learning Facilities Grant Program from the State Department of Commerce, the WELL program funded by Enterprise Community Partners, CRAFT3, and WCRA, and potential funding from the PASTER program, so retained sales tax from the construction of ST3, which can all help bridge the equity gap. Next slide, please. And as part of the vision, Housing Hope is interested in incorporating CLT into its new office headquarters and hopefully set another model for CLT office development. Development cost for CLT building is around $350 per square foot, and rents need to be around 26, 28 triple net in order to justify the construction. But we think that it's feasible to explore the new materials at this location. Chris, now I'll turn to Chris to walk you through the partnership strategy and timeline.
Yeah, before we, can you go back one slide, Lindsay, before we get lost in this one, or Dave? So in terms of the elements on the west side that we potentially have heard would be of interest, we have the Early Childhood Education Center, which operationally has a potential great operator, which is fantastic because oftentimes trying to find the right operator is a hurdle. But there's a yawning financial gap that has to be solved. And it's going to take time to solve, and it probably involves state legislature, and it's going to have a period of time. There's an interest in incorporating an office project, perhaps vertically into a mixed-use building that includes the Early Childhood Center and Housing Hope tax credit financed affordable housing project. That element of the office also is something that Housing Hope, if they want to be their own owner and developer, will have to raise. That's a capital campaign issue. So it's a matter of finding resources for that. If they want to find someone else's money to do it on a private sector basis, then they're going to have to pay rents or that are 2 times what the market basically is for, not quite 2 times, but just about 2 times as expensive as what is a or B market office rents in downtown Everett. And then there's that potential affordable, or pardon me, market rate housing that perhaps could be attracted to this site in the time frame of the next 3 to 5 years to begin development. If there's appropriate articulation of what the vision looks like, some plan to get to some of the public realm and transportation connectivity improvements that we were talking about earlier, and perhaps having Housing Hope really be the kind of lead sponsor to raise the flag for this site. So it's challenging to figure out where the value equation is to drive the capital needed to create this without an obvious kind of landing place for public sector dollars. So that's our challenge here. And we think that this is a great site that has a lot of potential, but it's going to need to be curated to some extent and slowly work to attract the right size and right scaled investment. So while there might be high-rise dreams or major project dreams, as most folks noted in the survey, we're probably a ways out from there. But we think this project, this area, can still be put in play in the near term. It'll just take some time to come to fruition. So to begin to move in that direction, we have two basic type models. We don't want to go into too much depth here, but one is a more traditional TOD, public asset disposition model, where there's a public ownership of land. There is a vision adopted for the area. The public seller or ground lessor of land commits to that vision and requires any proponents of projects to develop that vision and/or encumbers the land for that specific use. And that takes a lot of different forms. And then they procure for a team or multiple developments, which might be a team of a nonprofit and a for-profit model coming together to propose for the property, or it could be two separate property dispositions. This is much more common. It's relatively simple, but it's difficult to inject additional public dollars into that equation. And in this circumstance, there may be a desire to have a program here that the market simply will not, finance in the time frame that we have to look at it. In which case, figuring out more creative ways to bring public dollars into what I'm calling into the project itself, as opposed to the public realm around the project, may be warranted. The second scenario is more of a public development authority model. It could also be led by the city of Everett, but there may be some reason politically and financially to separate that out into a separate entity that doesn't yet exist. And under this scenario, there would be a authority that would then lead the coordination of facilitation of different buckets of public dollars and invest those both in infrastructure in the public realm, but also in block amenities. And those could be, job training centers. That could be dollars into childcare. That could be into, a number of different. It could even be into some types of retail that just aren't really financeable without bringing capital subsidy. And they could have a retained ownership in at least all the commercial elements of that project, and then figure out, probably with Housing Hope needed to finance their affordable housing with a separate ownership structure that have to be separately financed, and you'd figure out how to bring that into the equation. Could be through some kind of condominium structure. So, and then the balance of the property, to the extent you want private dollars, that has to be segmented out individually as well. And it could be through it's vertically through some kind of condominium structure, or through a sale or a lease of surplus land. So the pros there is a potential way to coordinate and access lower cost capital and to find public subsidy for things the market simply won't finance in the time frame we're talking about. The cons is a lot of additional complexity and time potentially. And to our last slide here is this may be slightly aggressive, but why not set the hopes, try to strive for greatness and then see what happens, right? The other one is under promise and over deliver, which is what the consultant teams are supposed to do. But let's put that aside for a moment. One idea would be to use 2021, if what's coming out of this study is enticing to folks, to get into more project level feasibility study and vision adoption. So there's a political element that kind of rests as with the city of Everett likely as the best champion here to figure out how to adopt that vision and promote it, and also begin to think about how to secure and coordinate infrastructure dollars, perhaps investigating also a PDA structure that might be a better steward to do that and what that would entail. And also beginning to negotiate with Sound Transit some of the parking agreements here, because without liberating this site from a substantial parking burden, there's nothing that's going to happen here in the near or midterm, frankly. And then from the Housing Hope being kind of the lead proponent, flag bearer for this project, there's some elements of exploring and beginning the financial conversations around their early childhood education and office projects. And then of course, those are things that they've looked into to some extent, to date. And then of course, the affordable housing program is sort of squarely in their strike zone, and it's a matter of timing and pipeline and figuring out where the organizational capacity lies to plan that project. But until there's some answer on how to think about the funding for the office and the early learning, that's going to hold up to some extent how to think about the coordination of the pieces within what we could call the Housing Hope program. In moving forward, then, if there's some clarity on those matters, then as early as 2022, there may be the potential to have an offering on the property. It has to be transacted to move either from the city, and the city could retain it obviously too for some period of time. But in theory, there's an asset disposition with a long-term kind of process to dispose, with a long-term closing on that land that's out in say 2 years later, which would then give the projects, both public and nonprofit and for-profit, potentially the time to do their fundraising, pre-development, and permitting before moving into construction. So as kind of a best case scenario with a right-sized project that's not too aggressive for the market and has a lot of things breaking favorably in terms of figuring out how to fund elements that are going to need substantial capital subsidies, this timeline is kind of the most aggressive that we can probably foresee.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Lancy, and the consultant team for that deeper dive into several of the issues that we're looking at. I just want to, in the interest of time, I'm going to blow through a couple slides just on how this might play out at a neighborhood level, essentially taking Chris's timeline graphic and just expanding that visually to the site, recognizing that we're in 2021 and at the outside edge of this project where Sound Transit is building potentially in 2036, projects might not be complete until 15 or 20 years from now. But just in terms of the early stage, the goal here would be to enable a Catalyst Housing Hope headquarters and early childhood education center on the west site that would help to build that, build the first components of that loop that Evan described, or the hub, which we're calling it, really on the western side of the station. And that as funding and financing becomes clearer for some of the mixed income affordable housing properties that could be co-located with those childhood education and office functions on the west, those could come into play, really building out the remainder of those sites, locating the replacement parking in an interim spot, either on the eastern side of the tracks or potentially on a site on Smith Avenue that Everett Transit controls. Over the 10 to 15 years, it could be that some of if Everett Public Works moves to the Epic site, or if it moves off site, that some of the properties up along Pacific could become available for disposition and development. The most likely scenario there is a mixed use condition, building in some of those buffers that could be public open spaces to the south, to really let the southern portion of the property play out in a variety of different ways, one of which could just simply be reinforcing the neighborhood industrial and manufacturing character of the district by enabling projects like that to go in. It could also be that something more ambitious and kind of all-encompassing is possible, in that a campus scale development could be attracted to that area, given just the size and scale of the potential development footprint. Or it could be that that things develop over time, and over 15, 20, or maybe even 30 or 35 years, that the neighborhood becomes kind of a more mixed use and integrated land use district in conjunction with downtown. And that's what we have today. I'm going to go to the last question and turn it back to Brock, and we can wrap up.
All right. This is real simple, which is, if you have questions, please type them in the chat so we can record them there in terms of textually knowing them. And then if you'd like to have specific follow-up about something, let us know, and we can, if you say yes there, we'll be able to know that and be able to follow up by email specifically. And that's the last thing here, so I can leave up that question, I think, to the end. Allow people to respond to it.
Yep. So I just want to say thank you to everybody on the call. Thank you to the consultant team, to Housing Hope and HopeWorks, to ESDA for organizing the meeting today. Really appreciate everybody's time and interest in this project. It is potentially a transformative component of the city of Everett kind of group of neighborhoods, and we're really looking forward to the potential that Everett Station can be. So with that, that's all I have. Brock, if there's anything from you.
Just thank you to everybody for staying through the meeting, and we look forward to working on what we heard today as what we've heard before, and we will post this presentation as a YouTube presentation for others who weren't able to be here, probably sometime next week. And I guess, Ed, as the Housing Hope representative, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I think we're positioned for the last 6 weeks of work here. It's going to be busy, and we welcome input from everyone. We think this neighborhood has huge potential to be both a job center and a transit-oriented development center with housing solutions that are desperately needed in our city. And Housing Hope is looking at this strictly as a feasibility and is offering to be an anchor for the development potentially, but not necessarily. This development could happen in a variety of different ways. So stay tuned and stay involved. In 6 weeks from now, we'll have a set of recommendations that will go forward. I think with that, we're going to close down the meeting, and thank you for being here.
And all right, I'm going to stop the recording.